Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
We're doing this again. This is very interesting. We're here live in New York City. And we're going to be talking about the Ukraine, the terrible tragedy of the war in Ukraine, and a little bit of the Jewish life, both past and present.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah. It's very scary what's happening right now. I just hope everyone's safe, but it's a good opportunity to learn about the uniqueness of the Jewish community there and the history about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I had some questions about that. First off, could you summarize for us just the general situation currently in Ukraine and how that affects the Jewish Ukrainians there?
Sure. So, currently, I mean, it's what is it, February? No, it's March 13th, I think, today.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a war going on where you have the Russian military under Vladimir Putin have basically gone in and decided that they're going to take the Ukraine. Of course, there's a lot of misinformation going on in Russia where they don't let them call it a war, they just call it a military operation. And there's a lot of geopolitical things that most of us don't really understand about NATO and about oil and many things that are kind of political that some people understand better than others, and many people try to understand it. But what we do know is that there's a humanitarian crisis in simple English. On the ground, there's millions of refugees, millions more remaining in the crosshairs of a war, basically. So that's what's going on, and there's the fifth largest Jewish community in the world, I believe the third largest in Europe, and they're part of the Ukrainian, the people of the Ukraine, and they're caught up in the middle of this like everyone else. So I wouldn't say better or worse. It's just terrible to be in that place right now. And people we know or people, relatives of, I think you had an aunt that just narrowly got out, and had a former person, the shul, who just got out, and lots of people that I know work in the Ukraine as rabbis and have large communities there.
Yeah. It definitely affects Jewish people a lot because of the population there. I think for a lot of people, the reason why it's hard to understand the situation now is because not a lot of people know about the overall history of Ukraine. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about, like, particularly the history of Ukraine pre-World War II, who was in control, and how that affected the Jewish community there.
So before World War II, basically Ukraine, what we call Ukraine now, was divided. A big part of it, the part closer to Russia, was part of Russia, or even if it had a separate name, it was a name only. It was really controlled by Russia, and other parts of the Ukraine that were closer to Czechoslovakia or Poland were controlled by those countries. So basically, the Ukraine, as we know it today, as an independent country, didn't exist at that time. That doesn't mean that it didn't exist ever. It had actually a long history, but often it was subsumed within those different powerful countries around it: Russia, Lithuania, Poland, which they were the main kind of countries that would take big portions of the Ukraine for hundreds of years. So Ukraine has a complicated history in terms of its independence. It definitely had independence at times, but often was part of these other countries divided up, and it had a very large Jewish population before World War II, and many Jews perished during the war. And there's a sad history for Jews, but there's also a tremendous vibrancy that we should talk about as well, not just the sadness, but also the greatness of the Jewish community that changed the world, basically, that came out of the Ukraine.
Absolutely. So on that, if we could speak a bit more about some of the Jewish figures historically in Ukraine and their influence.
Sure, Naomi. So there's so many Jewish figures that were born in what is now the Ukraine. It might not have been called Ukraine, as I mentioned. The borders were very fluid for many years. So I'm going to limit it to maybe 2 or 3 of literally hundreds of great figures. The one that I want to spend the most time with is the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem was his name. He was the founder of the Chassidic movement. The Chassidic movement is one of the most vibrant movements within Judaism today. And amongst its vibrancy, I should particularly mention the Chabad, Chassidic, part of the Chassidic movement overall, and their last Rebbe, the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the 7th Rebbe, was still considered the Rebbe by Chabad today, is from the Ukraine, or what is the Ukraine today. So let's talk a little bit about the Baal Shem Tov, because he was from the Ukraine. He was associated with Mezhebush, but he was also originally from the mountainous region of the Ukraine that's called the Carpathian Mountains. He lived about 300 years ago, and he liked to be in nature even as a child. He liked to take walks, to be surrounded by trees and wild animals, and pray to God. And while he would pray to God, all the little animals and big animals would come to hear him and just listen to him, until, according to legend, one day one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim was walking by, and he saw a little boy all alone without any fear in the middle of the forest, singing, praying, and all the animals, including some wild animals, scary ones ordinarily, were just encircling him, watching him. And he knew that this young man was a special person, and then he, associated him, took him under his wing, and taught him these mystical teachings, and initiated him into the secret society of the 36 hidden saints, which he eventually became the leader in, which he was still a secret saint, so to speak, a tzaddik nister it's called. And then eventually, supposedly at the age of 36, he revealed himself. He didn't just reveal himself, but he started what we now call the Chassidic movement, a huge impact on Judaism. We could talk more details, but that's the figure. Just that figure alone is worthy, really, to talk about the history of Jewish life in the Ukraine and how it impacted the rest of the Jewish world.
Absolutely. So how did it grow from there, the Chassidic movement, once the Baal Shem Tov revealed himself and once he started it? What did that really look like in terms of time? Like, how was that revolutionary for Judaism at that time in place?
So there's two things, both how it grew and also why it was revolutionary. Let's actually, what I'm going to do to answer that question is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Judaism in that general area, including Ukraine. And there was actually a tremendous uprising led by a very famous and hated Cossack in the Jewish world known as Bogdan Khmelnytsky. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name. He's got like a Polish-sounding name that's hard to pronounce. And he was very anti-Semitic, and he literally killed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews with his pogroms, just massacres. And that happened in the Ukraine, and that area was just terrible tragedy for the Jews. It took them a long time to recover. The feeling of helplessness after that devastation was so strong that the Baal Shem Tov felt the thing that the Jews needed was comfort and to be lifted up, not to be put down. And there were other rabbis, some of them were well-meaning. They had a tradition of humility, and humility included kind of reminding people to be humble and also to respect the Torah. And they may have inadvertently kind of, at the expense of the simple people, lifted up the Torah in a way that the people who didn't have access to Torah knowledge, who weren't Torah scholars, felt like second class. They were second class from the outside, that's for sure, because they were persecuted. And they were second class from the inside because they weren't learned. That's a simple and probably somewhat truthful explanation of what why the Baal Shem Tov feel there needed to be something that would turn that around, give the simple Jews pride of feeling good about themselves despite their lack of knowledge. So what he right away did is he said, a rabbi who feels greater than a simple person because of his learning is not closer to God, is further away from God. That was very radical at that time, and caused animosity, caused another movement in reaction to Hasidism called Misnagdim. So maybe you could actually say Hasidim and Misnagdim.
But Misnagdim didn't call themselves Misnagdim, right?
They were called, the Hasidim called them Misnagdim.
Right.
Misnagdim means they were in opposition.
Right.
So they opposed Hasidism, and one of the things they opposed was what they felt was this emphasis on deed and joy rather than learning, and felt that it was too easy almost, and was degrading the role of the Torah scholar.
Right.
I don't think it was degrading really Torah scholarship per se, as much as the feeling that Judaism was only valuable in as much as where you ranked in terms of your Torah scholarship. That they were trying to take that away.
Right.
I'll give you an example. The great grandson of the most famous great grandson. He had some famous descendants. The most famous great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov was called Rabbi Nachman of Uman, who's buried in the Ukraine. He's from the Ukraine, buried in the Ukraine, in the town of not Uman, where is he buried? Trying to remember where Rabbi Nachman was buried. I guess
This was before, like,
I guess he's buried.
Right?
Yeah. This is going back to the time of the beginning of the Chabad movement. I guess it's Uman. So he's buried in Uman. Why am I getting confused? Because why do they call you? He didn't live in Uman. He died in Uman. He specifically went to Uman because there had been a massacre 100 years earlier, a mass Jewish grave, that he felt there needed to be a kind of rectification for their souls. So he wanted to be buried there. So he went and he was buried there. And he said, whoever comes to me on Rosh Hashanah, I'm going to take them out of hell by their payas. I'll shut them out. So that's why there's a lot of Jews. They go there. 40,000 Jews lately have been going to Uman for the high holidays. Mostly men. So one of the people who come to the shul, the Kabbalah shul, is a Misnagid. Yeah, not a Chassid, not a Breslover at all. But he happens to be a descendant of Reb Nachman of Uman. So he decided he was going to spend Rosh Hashanah with Reb Nachman at his grave with these 40,000 Chassidim. So he comes back, and I see him in the shul, and he says, Naftali, I want to share with you what I got out of being in Uman for Rosh Hashanah. So I said, so what did you get? He said, I know for a lot of people, just being in a place where there's, you're in a minyan with 10,000 Jews, that itself is huge. The energy is tremendous. But this is not. I've been to Lakewood for Rosh Hashanah, so I know what it's like to daven with 10,000 Jews. He said, for me, what was special about Uman is there were Rosh Yeshivas, there were deans of yeshivas, well-versed in the entirety of the Talmud, and they were standing next to men who were covered from head to toe with tattoos, and there was no difference between them. They were just in front of God. It wasn't like, he said, every other place I've ever been, the Rosh Hashiva, is the Rosh Hashiva. You afford him honor and respect. And the other guy is kind of a lowlife. He's there, you barely tolerate him. Nobody's looking up to him. But in Uman, everyone was equal. That is the Chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov. That's the new concept of the Baal Shem Tov, that you're just getting close to God. That's what it's all about. So it's not about your title. It's not about what you know. It's about getting close to God. But that was very controversial because a lot of people, like, it's the equivalent of, did you go to Harvard? And that's what makes you, did you go to the Mir? Did you go to what yeshiva did you go to? How much Talmud do you know by heart? There's a lot of ego identification. And the Baal Shem Tov just kind of destroyed that. Of course, there was a reaction. The Mistagim were very unhappy. They condemned him and his followers. But that came out of somewhere in Ukraine. Very powerful. There's many other powerful things that he taught. That was one of the things, serve God with joy. That's what we say today, serve God with joy.
Yeah. Putting the emphasis on, there's still emphasis in Chassidic Judaism on learning, but also putting emphasis on davening and finding meaning behind the lessons and joy, like you said, and ways to
davening.
improve.
Yes, davening was a big thing. Yeah, because they saw davening also as being neglected. So you could also say it was like a revolution in prayer, in like getting close to God. Interestingly enough, eventually it became getting close to God through the Rabbis, by getting connected to the tzaddikim, to the holy people. But originally the Baal Shem Tov really put it back into every person's, man and women, into their hands to feel close to God.
Absolutely. So the Baal Shem Tov is definitely one, like you said, that alone shows the massive amount of influence of Jewish Ukrainians. But what are one or two other Jewish figures in Ukrainian history that come to mind for the influence?
So I would say, we were just talking about Rabbi Nachman. I also mentioned Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's a lot of also even secular, I don't know how secular they were. Maybe they started off in the yeshiva, like Bialik was a famous Hebrew poet. And people, there's just so many people. But let's talk about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because I want to talk about Chassidism, which basically came out. That was the cradle of Chassidism, was in the Ukraine. And then, by the way, much of other parts of what was Hungary and Czechoslovakia are now what's called Ukraine. So you have other Chassidic groups currently very active, very vibrant, that the villages they came from are maybe part of the Ukraine today. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe, not only did he come from the Ukraine, but the city that he came from, in tribute to him to some degree, and also in tribute to the Chabad rabbis who now run the Chabad center there, has what's considered the largest Jewish center in not just the country or even Europe, but the world, called the Menorah Center, which is in Dnieper, which is the region where the Rebbe was from. It used to be called Yekaterinoslav or Dnepropetrovsk, and now it's shortened down to Dnieper. That region has quite a few Jews, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe's contribution to Judaism are huge, and that he, like the Baal Shem Tov, he decided that in his way, that we're not going to wait for a Jewish community to kind of to be there because it's there, but we're going to go to where there are Jews and create community. So that was kind of it was a process that really started flowering in the beginning of the 70s, and then the 80s and 90s, and just is now
the
Chabad,
19 or 18?
1970s.
Oh, right.
But I mean, the seeds were already being...
Yeah,
the seeds were already being sown in the 50s and the 60s, but it really, as a movement that became kind of just putting these Chabad centers in every major city and then every small city, and including in the former
Shluchim, you're talking
Shluchim,
about, right?
and including in the former Soviet Union. There were secret things going on while the Soviet Union was still in power, but as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, they sent official shluchim to Russia and to the Ukraine. Where one of the sad things is that there are Chabad rabbis in Russia and the Ukraine, and they're divided by the fact that they have to be in these countries that are at war with each other. They have nothing against each other, but there they are in these two different countries.
Right. Yeah, that's really the tragedy of the situation. So if we could bring it back to how the Chabad movement or the Chassidic movement overall, how has that evolved from the time period of you were just talking about to today in Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting because the Chassidic movement that was born in the Ukraine and now has like been reborn in a sense out of the Ukraine. A lot has happened in the 250 plus years of its existence. First of all, it grew by leaps and bounds under one of the charismatic students of the Baal Shem Tov named the Maggid of Mizrich. I mean, Maggid just means a preacher. But the Maggid of Mizrich, he taught a group of students that each became so powerful in their own right that they each took a region and transformed that region into a region that Hasidism would become accepted in and powerful in. And that happened. So within about 75 years of the Baal Shem Tov, 100 years of the Baal Shem Tov, much of Eastern Europe was transformed into Hasidic communities. If not outright Hasidic communities, the majority or sizable minority were Hasidic in many communities. So that happened back then. The Holocaust was devastating to Hasidim. There were Hasidic groups of let's say in Poland there was Alexander Hasidim along with Ger Hasidim. So the Ger was the larger of the two groups. Ger might have had 400, maybe 500,000 Hasidim, and Alexander had 100 and whatever change, maybe 150,000 Hasidim. Alexander, after the war, doesn't exist almost. Maybe they were not always friendly, Alexander and Ger Hasidim, but after the war, maybe the few remaining Alexander Hasidim became Ger because that was what was available to them. Something they were familiar with, even if it wasn't what they were. So that
Around how many Ger were left?
Many of them were killed. I don't know the exact number. Many of them were killed, but thank God, Ger today is a very big movement again. With maybe I think it's the third biggest Chassidic movement. So they might be back up to 300,000-400,000 Chassidim, but it's still less than what they were before the war, I'd say, and that's with the huge birth rate and everything, and other groups merging into them. So you could imagine there are these groups that basically don't exist. They're just a shell of what existed before the war because of the war. But at the same time, there's still vibrancy in the Hasidic world. Chabad, most notably, is reviving communities that didn't have, some communities already had, and Chabad just added their presence to existing communities, but they also went into communities where there was very little of a Jewish establishment, and they really added to those communities. So there's still vibrancy in the Chassidic world. There's always room for renewal, for finding new ways to get passionate about Judaism, to go back to some of the core things of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was somewhat controversial, so some of the followers of the Baal Shem Tov kind of toned down the nature of the radicalism of the Baal Shem Tov that made it a little more acceptable to mainstream it. Yeah. So,
what were those more radical elements?
Well, the more radical elements were like meditating on the sound of your voice in the prayer, like using that technique that the sound itself could like take you inside to kind of this spiritual realm, the soul realm, and divine realm. That was a very basic technique that he talked about. I don't think it's really that controversial per se, but I don't see people doing it. I don't find it practiced in the Chassidic world.
Maybe considered controversial because in Judaism, like it's kind of frowned upon to anything that could be taken as like you making yourself more than human or kind of like a prophet. That's why kind of like with the Christians, that's why like the Jesus figure is kind of like frowned upon, like that type of like doing something that would make you like fly in the air or something like that.
Yeah, maybe the fear that the spirituality is dangerous, because if you find your own way to God, then you don't need all of the books behind you. You don't need all the laws somehow. I think that's often an excuse for people trying to not experience God more directly. Mm-hmm. But yes, that was part of the reason why the controversial, like kind of spiritual power that the Baal Shem Tov advocated was like kind of the faucet of that was diminished definitely by outside opposition, but even internally. Yeah, there's always this caution in Judaism that it shouldn't become too spiritual, because then people will think that you don't need the mitzvot. You'll just get your heart alone will connect you to God. So there's this tension in Judaism, and that swings back and forth.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So you mentioned a story earlier about Rabbi Nachman, which is very touching. I was wondering if any more like focal point stories come to mind that bring home really the history or a greater general lesson of Chassidic Judaism or any type of movement from Ukraine.
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of stories of the Baal Shem Tov, and one of the stories, and we could finish with this. Is a great story. Was that there was a Italian wealthy patron who would give anyone a golden coin who would tell a story about the Baal Shem Tov. And one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov, when the Baal Shem Tov was on his deathbed, the Baal Shem Tov called him over and he said, "Look, I want to make you my official storyteller. You know, you go and tell my stories. You've been around, you know what happened, tell my stories." So he heard that there was this Italian nobleman giving out a gold coin for any story. So he figured he knew hundreds of stories. He's going to be rich. He's going to get 100 gold coins. So he travels to Italy. He visits this man. And it's like Thursday, and the man welcomes him, and he has a nice, beautiful dinner for him. And he doesn't remember one story. So the guy says, "You're tired, go to your guest house. There's a bath waiting for you there. You'll get a good night's sleep. And tomorrow, it's Shabbos, we'll share stories of the whole community." So Friday night, everybody is there. They're waiting for the stories. Nothing. Guy forgets every story. Saturday, the same thing repeats itself. Saturday night, the same thing repeats itself. It's embarrassing. The guy's humiliated. You know, he claimed to be the number one storyteller of the Baal Shem Tov stories, and he's got nothing. Sunday, he really apologizes to the host, and he takes leave. And he remembers one story as he's like, half a mile out of the driveway of this wealthy Italian Jew. He turns around and he, pulls his horse and wagon back into this villa, and he goes in and he sees that this guy is just drenched in tears. He's crying so he says, "I remember the story." I said, "Okay, tell me the story." He sits down and he says, "There was a pogrom being planned. And there was a priest, and by the way, this is kind of a little bit the sad history of the Ukraine. The Baal Shem Tov stops a pogrom, or tries to stop a pogrom. Baal Shem Tov goes to where the pogrom is being planned, and he goes to the Jewish home opposite the square where all these peasants are gathering. And what it is one speaker after another riling them up. The Jews killed their savior, the Jews stole their money, the Jews, all the lies and disgusting, things that fill them with hatred. But the main keynote speaker is an anti-Semitic priest. And everybody's, whatever Jews are in that area are totally locked in their homes with every board and every lock, trying to protect themselves, not making a sound. Baal Shem Tov opens the window and he's looking and he tells the host, who happens to be one of his followers, I want you to go right now and get the priest, tell him that I'm waiting for him right now. So this Jew goes out there and pushes his way through the crowd. And he goes to the priest. The Baal Shem Tov wants you to speak to him. He says, I tell the Baal Shem Tov I can't talk to him right now. I'm the next speaker. I can't leave right now. Then this goes back and forth, but he goes back and the Baal Shem Tov says, no, go get him. Tell him he has to come now. I don't want no excuses. So this time he's very forceful. He says, Baal Shem Tov says, you have to come now. So he follows this guy. And the Baal Shem Tov goes into a room, locks the door, and a few hours later, this guy's eyes are red with tears.
The priest.
The priest. Turns out the priest had been born a Jew, but to compensate, when he converted to Christianity, he wanted to show he's not Jewish at all. He has no love for the Jews, so he became anti-Semitic. He called self-hating Jew. And he was the worst of them. But the Baal Shem Tov basically somehow got through to him, and he helped him do tshuva. They took him to the mikvah, and the storyteller says, I was in the house when this happened. He said, I don't know the rest of the story, but that anti-Semitic priest did tshuva. That's the story. Man said, I'm the priest.
Whoa.
I'm the priest.
The rich Italian Jew who was always trying to pay
I'm
people
the priest.
to get
He says the reason why I paid people is because after the Baal Shem Tov got, awakened my soul and showed me the error of my ways, I said, I am directly responsible for the death of a number of Jews. How will I ever be forgiven? The Baal Shem Tov says, when the story of what happened today is told to you, you'll know you're forgiven. So I've been giving out a gold coin, hoping that one day you would come and tell that story. And when you came and you didn't know any stories, I took that as a sign that I wasn't forgiven. I'll never be forgiven. And that's why I was crying, because I felt my sins will never be forgiven. And that's when you came back. That's when my tshuva was accepted. That's when you remembered that story. That's why you came here. So that's a beautiful story that didn't have a good part of it, but ended well. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit, we hope and pray for the people of Ukraine, like that story. Even though there's history of anti-Semitism there, we're not judging the people now. They're regular people. We're not judging them. We want them only to be safe, Jew and non-Jew alike. And we hope that this conflict will end very quickly and Ukraine will be able to continue to live peacefully without this terrible tragedy that's unfolding there for them.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really illuminating discussion.
Good. Well, we'll do this again soon, hopefully with
there's
good news, not just
Yes.
terrible things in the world. We hope good things for the world. We send them our love. We should support those who need help there and try to make sure the world is a better place and call on the world to put pressure that this conflict should be resolved in a way that nobody more needs to die.
100%.
Okay.